well-being, and the pursuit of self-interest by those in the financial industry has brought our economy to the brink of the abyss. Now, as I say, this is well known to economists, but Smith's message was seized in a sort of popularized, dumbed-down way, I guess, by market fundamentalists in the past 30 years, until it has almost become dogmatic that regulation only harms the market and is therefore not only unwelcome, but actually immoral. But let me return to the issue of social physics more generally. The Scottish social physicist James Clerk Maxwell was impressed by Henry Buckle's book on historical determinism, and when Maxwell came to study the problems of gases, in which there are lots of different particles that are constantly undergoing collisions that no one can ever hope to see or follow, he recognized that this was the same kind of problem that Buckle had looked at in society, where you can never sort of figure out the causes of individual behavior. But the fact that there were nevertheless statistical regularities in society made Maxwell believe that it was worth looking for laws in gases, despite the fact that you never know everything about the particles themselves. And the Austrian physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who developed those ideas further, also knew about Buckle's work, and he made explicit analogies between his particles and the individuals in the society and in the social censuses that gave Buckle his statistics. So the work of Maxwell and Boltzmann led to the discipline known today as statistical mechanics or statistical physics. And one of the central ideas of this topic is that these systems of many interacting particles tend to adopt the lowest energy state where they're all in equilibrium. Now, early developments in economics drew on these ideas, and they seem to justify Adam Smith's idea that there is an invisible hand that keeps markets in equilibrium. And this set in place the conviction that a market enjoys that has perfect, unimpeded competition, where everyone knows what's going on, that this market will reach a stable equilibrium. Now, of course, no one can ignore the fact that markets fluctuate all the time, but the prevailing view is that this was just noise. This is just inevitable randomness. That these are just fluctuations around this equilibrium state. The problem is not that economics was being guided here by physics, but that it was using the wrong sort of physics. We now know that many processes in the world, including the process of life itself, aren't in equilibrium. They're constantly driven away from it by energy and materials being fed into the system. It seems clear that the equilibrium view of economics rarely, if ever, applies in the real world. Not just because not everyone has access to all information, but because economic markets are themselves fundamentally non-equilibrium systems. So these erratic fluctuations in the market like this are not driven by outside influences, but are fundamental to the way markets work. They're loosely similar to the way that a pile of sand will undergo avalanches, fluctuations of all different sizes as fresh grains are poured onto the top. Now, this idea has some influential supporters in economics, but nevertheless it's been resisted for a long time, partly because it makes the traditional models of economics hard to solve and so inconvenient. But the real issue is much broader than that, because economic markets are just one example of a wide range of social systems and behaviours that can be thought of as collections of interacting particles that are out of equilibrium. And the surprise is that in recent years it's become clear that several of these can be modelled with some realism without having to think about any sort of complex psychology of the agents involved. The behaviour that comes out is more determined by just the mere fact that the agents are interacting than by the fine details of what those interactions are. And I want to give you some examples, some modern examples of how these ideas from statistics statistical physics are starting to feed into the social sciences. And to start off with, I want to talk about a very simple system that looks at how people move around space. Some people in Germany devised a model for how people do that, which basically considered people to be just particles that interact through forces of attraction and repulsion. Now that might sound unlikely, but if you want to see that sort of process, so it looks something like this. If you want to see this sort of process at work, just take a look at a crowded beach, where people have, because of what seems to be this sort of force of repulsion, they space themselves more or less evenly, a more or less even distance apart. So, nobody comes and sits right next to this guy in the front with his towel. They'll leave a little bit of room. Now, the point is that there isn't really a force of repulsion between people that we can measure, as we can for magnets, say, but we act as though there is. And so you can make a model of human motion on that basis. And this research has looked at how people behave in those situations, these very simple particle people, if you like. In one case, they looked at how people move up and down crowded corridors. So here's a snapshot of that sort of computer model of how people move, where you can see the red arrows and the blue arrows are moving in opposite directions down the corridor. And what's happened here is that they've organized themselves into streams that are following one another. Now, there's nothing in the rules of the model that would enable you to predict that that's what would happen. You just have to run it and see. This behavior just emerges when you look at what comes out. The interesting thing is that that's actually quite intelligent. It makes sense to organize themselves that way, because that makes it less likely that you will collide with someone coming the other way. But of course these particles don't know that. They have no intelligence at all. They're just feeling forces. So this model seems to create what looks like intelligent anticipatory behavior from just these very simple rules. But if people are programmed to behave a little differently, to move faster, for example, in a situation where they're in a crowded room and they want to get out very quickly, then a different sort of behavior can emerge. It looks like this. This is another snapshot. So here, the same rules apply, but people have been just programmed to move faster. And that wish to go fast can override this repulsive force, and it can bring people into contact. And then, because they're sort of frictional people, they start to rub up against each other and jam. And that's what can happen in a situation like this. And what it means is that it becomes very hard for people to get out of the room. They can get jammed in the doorway, and people only pop out very sporadically. So, someone pops out and then nothing happens for a while. And the end result is that although everyone is trying to move faster, the room actually empties much more slowly than it would do if people were moving at a more moderate pace. And effects like this, which is probably what happens when a crowd panics, can be very important for planners and architects who are trying to design safety measures for public spaces. And in fact, models like this have been used in that way. For example, some people in London have collaborated with the organisers of the Notting Hill Carnival in London, which takes place on streets in West London. And they've tried to, basically, they run a system like this of sort of moving particle people on the street plan of that carnival to try to figure out where the flash points are, where this kind of congestion is likely to happen, so that they can focus safety measures there. And models like this are now being used to plan urban spaces. There's a London-based company called Space Syntax who have used these models to redesign public spaces like Trafalgar Square, pedestrianised spaces. Now, it's not a big step, I expect you can see, to go from moving people, pedestrians, to traffic. In fact, in some ways, road traffic is even simpler because we have even less choice. We simply move down the road in single file, one after the other, in a single direction. And all we can really do is we interact with other cars by slowing down, if necessary, to avoid collisions. So again, there is this repulsion, effectively a